All right. Well, thank you all for coming. My name is Jamil Jaffer, and I'm the Director of the Homeland and National Security Law Program here at the George Mason University School of Law. I want to thank our sponsors first for this event. First and foremost, the National Security Law Journal, the George Mason University School of Law, the Biodefense Program at George Mason University, and the School of Public Policy, as well as the Intelligence and National Security Alliance. Thank you all for coming. I'm just going to say a few words about General Hayden. As you know, General Hayden was the Director of Central Intelligence. He also served as the first Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence and as the Director of the National Security Agency. General Hayden will introduce the topic. He'll call Michael Allen up to talk about his book, and then we'll engage in a discussion. So with that, General Hayden.
Well, thank you very much. Good to be here with some good friends. Jamil asked me to come. I never really pressed him as why he would have me be here, just kind of asking the questions. Other than I was one of the early victims of the new Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, the Director of NSA and first Principal Deputy, and then had to live with it as Director of CIA. So I got lots of questions for these guys. I want to know how this thing came about, and I want their opinions as to how they think it's working. I think what we'll do, as Jamil suggested, let Michael kind of lay down the basic premises of his book, and then I'll ask Chuck, and I'll introduce Chuck in due course as we go through these, for his reaction, his perspective on the historical narrative that Michael lays out, because Chuck saw it from a different perspective. We'll have a bit of a conversation up here. My job is simply to get these folks to talk about their views on the statute, the process that got us to the statute, and then we're going to leave time for questions. You see the microphones about the room. All right, so no later than 7. We'll invite you folks to come on up and ask any and all of us questions that might be on your mind. So let me begin. Michael's a good friend. Michael was the one who actually shepherded me through congressional confirmation, senatorial confirmation for Director of CIA. Michael was in Legislative Affairs Office in the White House, so he got to see this very close up as a member of the executive branch, responsible for attending and minding the legislative branch. So it really gives him a very unique perspective. Michael then went on from that task to stay at the NSC, worked on counterproliferation. Then with the change of administrations, he was hired to be the staff director of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, a position he held until just a very short time ago, actually about the time the book was published. So Michael really does have an up-close and personal view of how the law came about, how it was processed in both the executive and legislative branch, and then how our government had to live with the implications of the law as a member up there on Mike Rogers' staff. So Michael, let me ask you to begin.
Thank you, General Hayden, for the introduction, and I want to thank George Mason University for having me this evening. I think this is a very important and timely topic. The Director of National Intelligence and the National Counterterrorism Center are the two institutions that the Congress and the President got together on and decided that the country needed in terms of reform of the intelligence community after not one but 2 intelligence failures within a 4-year period. Of course, we're all familiar with the 9/11 attacks. The CIA, I think, took a particular beating during the hearings of the joint inquiry in Congress. This was the 2 intelligence committees that got together and tried to investigate just what went wrong on 9/11. Congress set up a 9/11 commission to investigate exactly what went wrong on 9/11. And then in the midst of the 9/11 Commission's investigation into what happened on September 11th, another intelligence failure came into stark relief, and that was the Iraq WMD assessment, the now infamous National Intelligence Estimate on Iraq. Essentially what the 9/11 Commission did was make a series of recommendations that had been around since the National Security Act of 1947 had enacted the Central Intelligence Agency as the centralized leader in intelligence. You all know, of course, the most famous mission of the CIA, and that is to recruit spies across the world to work on behalf of the United States. You're also familiar with the covert action mission of the Central Intelligence Agency, but the 1947 Act also gave the CIA the ability and indeed the authority, or at least the responsibility, to coordinate the varying different intelligence agencies across the government. You all know now, of course, the National Security Agency, made famous, unfortunately, by Edward Snowden's revelations on the front page of the Washington Post. But keep the NSA in mind, because it was one of the major factories of intelligence. It is one of the major factories of intelligence in that it produces signals intelligence, just like the National Geospatial Agency, also here in Washington, produces photographic intelligence. But the key point, and central to what the 9/11 Commission recommended, is that both of these intelligence agencies resided in the Department of Defense. And what the 9/11 Commission decided is that U.S. intelligence was too fractured, did not work closely together, not close enough to meet a new agile threat of the 21st century, namely stateless international terrorists, and decided that in order to be able to better share information, to work more cohesively together, we needed a superstructure to sit on top of the CIA and the other agencies of the intelligence community, no matter which departments they resided in. Of course, chiefly in the Department of Defense. The 9/11 Commission decided that the CIA director, who was also dual-hatted as the Director of Central Intelligence, he had two roles simultaneously. The 9/11 Commission decided this was too much for one individual to be able to do, that we needed an impartial arbiter of resources, and that the Congress should create a Director of National Intelligence who had enhanced authorities for budget, enhanced authorities for personnel, in order to be able to control all of the intelligence agencies around the federal government. This inspired one of the greatest bureaucratic fights in modern American history. The idea that we would centralize more authority in the intelligence community, namely in a Director of National Intelligence, a new office, inspired fierce opposition not only from the CIA, because it was losing one of its chief missions, that of correlating and coordinating all of the intelligence community, but it also inspired the fierce opposition of Secretary Rumsfeld, Vice President Cheney, and the Department of Defense. Of course, Secretary Cheney himself had been a Secretary of Defense in the first Bush administration, and had long been opposed to further centralization in the intelligence community. They argued vociferously to President Bush that we not create a Director of National Intelligence. Secretary Rumsfeld, who, as you all know, is quite quotable, sent a variety of memos known as snowflakes over to President Bush, arguing that he should not embrace the 9/11 Commission's recommendation for a Director of National Intelligence. He, sort of dripping with sarcasm and a little bit of disdain, mocked the congressional rush to endorse the 9/11 Commission's recommendations. He wrote to the President, "Members of Congress, the press, and John Kerry can say what they want and afford to be wrong, and there is no penalty. The President of the United States has to be right on something of this importance. Caution." He ended the memo with just one word: caution. Secretary Rumsfeld also lamented that the people in Congress who were crafting this new intelligence system were amateur brain surgeons. And Vice President Cheney said, "We're in the middle of a war in Iraq and Afghanistan, both of which are complicated and different, and we're in the middle of rearranging the deck chairs of the Titanic." So you saw two views come into view after the 9/11 Commission made its recommendations. The 9/11 Commission's approach, which was supported by many of Congress. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you had those that believed that the Department of Defense's mission of supplying intelligence to the warfighter, that should remain the preeminent mission of the intelligence community, especially the NSA and the NGA, the two factories of intelligence that I mentioned that reside in the Department of Defense. A third camp emerged in opposition to the 9/11 Commission. And this is where it gets interesting, because our distinguished friend General Hayden was among the dissenters urging on President Bush to not endorse a 9/11 Commission. And the third school, advocated principally by General Hayden and Director Clapper, who at the time was the head of NGA, but now, of course, in the irony of ironies, is the Director of National Intelligence and is in charge of living with and implementing the system as we created. They both forecasted to the President that if you endorsed the 9/11 Commission recommendations, the center of intelligence would be no stronger under a Director of National Intelligence than the center had been under a CIA director who was dual-hatted with those responsibilities to coordinate intelligence community, intelligence assets across the community. They argued that a 9/11 Commission, if we adopted the 9/11 Commission's recommendations, that we would have a feckless Director of National Intelligence. They argued for the other side of the coin, which is that we ought to take the intelligence factories, NSA and NGA, and even other intelligence producing entities around the federal government, and put them directly under the Director of National Intelligence. As students of intelligence know, the three magic words in bureaucratic politics in Washington are authority, direction, and control. Generals Hayden and Clapper said that unless the DNI has those three magic words, that kind of authority over all of the intelligence agencies across the executive branch, that the enterprise would be doomed to fail. These three bureaucratic efforts, or three schools of thought, fought fiercely in the National Security Council in August and September of 2004 amidst the backdrop of a looming presidential election in which John Kerry had endorsed the 9/11 Commission recommendations all of 17 minutes after they were announced. And President Bush endorsed the 9/11 Commission despite some of the reservations among his principal advisors 10 days after the 9/11 Commission had announced their recommendations. I'll wind up here with a little bit about, I'll fast forward through the legislative debate, and maybe we'll talk about it a little bit during the question and answer session. Chuck Alsop, our co-panelist here, was on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and it was among those who I believe thought that the Director of National Intelligence should not gain power at the expense of the Secretary of Defense. And Chuck, of course, later ended up working for the DNI, so it'll be very interesting to hear Chuck's perspective. And we have another legislative protagonist here in the audience, and that's Phil Kiko, who was a graduate here of George Mason and worked for Chairman Sensenbrenner, who was also involved in a lot of the efforts in the House of Representatives to back the DOD Rumsfeld-Cheney side of the argument. The book, Blinking Red, goes through not only the NSC, the National Security Council's debate around the three schools that I mentioned, but also, frankly, through all of the legislative wrangling that led to the Intelligence Reform Act and the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004 that created a DNI and an NCTC. This, I mentioned at the beginning that this is a very timely issue today, as Edward Snowden, I believe, has put particular pressure on the intelligence community, and most people are calling for enhanced oversight, not only from the courts and the Congress, but also from the DNI, who is invested who is vested with these types of oversight responsibilities. So the question I would put to you, I think, was put succinctly by Secretary Gates. At the time he was president of Texas A&M. He was asked by President Bush to be the first director of national intelligence, and he examined the Intelligence Reform Act and decided that the DNI did not have the authorities to match the responsibilities that Congress gave the DNI in legislation. He forecast some of the stresses that the DNI would have with the Director of Central Intelligence, and he wrote in some emails he shared with me to Andy Card, who at that time was the Chief of Staff. Secretary Gates was seeking all sorts of reassurances to compensate for the weaknesses in the law, and he wrote to Andy Card, "The President needs to make clear that the DNI is the head of the intelligence community, not some mere budgeteer or coordinator. Without such an explicit mandate, the DNI would be doomed to fail." So here we are again in another time of intense pressure on the intelligence community. When people are asking, does the IC work for the United States? Has it made the country safer? And we're at a situation now where people are questioning these post 9/11 institutions and asking whether they are indeed effective, and how we ended up with the authorities and the set of responsibilities that we did. And blinking red is an attempt to lay down on paper all of the arguments that we considered at the time in 2004 in creating this new institution, which turned out to have been the most substantial revision to our national security infrastructure since the post-World War II period. So with that, I hope that sets the table for an interesting discussion, and I turn it over to General Hayden.
Michael, thank you. Thank you very much. It really does lay out the issues that were involved in this. It really was a very intensely debated activity, and human emotions at many times were quite raw. We'll probably get into a few examples as to how this developed on a human, not just an institutional level. And keep in mind what's being done here, what Michael's pointed out. This is the first substantial restructuring of the American security establishment since the 1947 National Security Act, which created the DCI and CIA. It was being done at the height of war. And Michael lays out the three camps, I think, pretty wisely. You know, the legislation as it was kind of plugging along. People mostly in defense, but not totally, who didn't think this trip was necessary. And then he categorizes me and Jim Clapper fairly well. We're kind of in this, we don't think this trip is necessary, but we're also sure this train is leaving the station. And therefore, our decision was, we're going to make this worse unless we really put a lot of bricks in the rucksack of this new Director of National Intelligence. And of course, Michael's book is the story as to what we did or didn't do in terms of putting things in the backpack of this new fellow in terms of matching responsibilities with his authority. Now, Michael's already made reference to our good friend Chuck here. Chuck is a career intelligence officer in a variety of venues and fora, and that's why we have him up here. Department of Defense, on the Hill, and in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. So Chuck, based upon the laydown that Michael's given, how did all this look to you as a career intelligence officer? And number one, was the 9/11 Commission diagnosis correct, that we needed to be restructured? How do you think the debate went? And since you had to live with the results of the restructuring when you got to the DNI office, how do you think it all turned out?
So, thanks for the easy question first. I think it was the second DNI, Mike McConnell, that always liked to say that we've studied the intelligence community multiple times over the last 50 years, since 1947, longer than 50 years. And there is no shortage of recommendations on how to fix the intelligence community. It's just a matter of enacting it. What goes along with that is the idea of separating the DCI from the DCIA was not a new idea from the 9/11 Commission. That idea had been out there for a while, but there was just no political will or other will to do much about it. And that kind of gets me to the point. It's hard in retrospect to create the atmospherics that were about in July of 2004 because I don't think many people had ever seen anything quite like this. There's lots of commissions in Washington. I think some of my Hill colleagues will agree that a not infrequent option sometimes when you can't come up with a solution is to appoint a commission. And then when the commission reports out, you have a press conference and everybody accepts the glossy copy of the report and it goes into the dustbin of history. And that is generally what happens with commission findings. Not always that way. Sometimes we take some of it. But the 9/11 Commission was different. And the reason it was different, they reported out in July of 2004. It was an extremely well-written report. I mean, it was not the normal commission report. It was extremely well-written and very compelling. But it had the increased or the extra advantage of having a very powerful group of people that advocated for the implementation of the recommendations, and that was the 9/11 families. So, to put it in perspective, if you, and I've got to put one other piece of environment in there also, from my personal perspective. Something else that happened in 2004 that wasn't particularly good for the intelligence community was that the Abu Ghraib detainee abuse came to light in April-May timeframe of 2004. And that was already something that was swirling quite uncomfortably on the Hill. Lots of hearings, people being brought in front of committees to explain what had happened and why, and so forth. For me personally, that was my issue during that period of time, and I was so looking forward to August of 2004 because that's when members go out of town. That's when staff gets their time to travel or take vacation or whatever you're going to do in August. August disappeared in August of 2004. There were hearings every week, sometimes multiple hearings by the Senate Government Affairs Homeland Security Committee, bringing former DCIs in front. Interestingly, in one of those hearings, where they had, I think, 4 former DCIs, when the question went around to the DCIs of, did you ever focus on the community, or did you always focus on CIA operations? The only former DCI that said that he had focused on the community, the intelligence community, was Stansfield Turner. And he said he had his deputy focus on operations in the agency, and he focused on the community. Everybody else said that they just got consumed by the day-to-day running of the CIA. And I think you said the same thing when you got there, that you didn't understand how one person could possibly keep up with all those tasks. So it wasn't a new idea, but it was packaged in a different way. It had a lot of momentum behind it, and it caused the creation of this will to do something about it. So we went through August of hearings. We went through September on the floor. That's where I got to know Michael well, as he was the White House Legislative Affairs guy on the Hill, doing the back and forth. And we produced what we thought was a reasonable piece of legislation that went over to the House. Now that's where I commend the book to you. And Michael didn't pay me to tell you this, but I commend the book to you because that book filled in a lot of details for me. Because from my perspective, on the Senate side, that thing went to the House and disappeared for 4 months. And now I understand why. And it's fascinating to read the issues that Chairman Sensenbrenner and Chairman Hunter were bringing. Now, I was working for Senator John Warner at the time on the Senate Armed Services Committee. And I think at some point in September, when we were on the floor, when we were in arguments about the what ultimately was the provision 1018 language, the preservation of authority language and so forth. At one point in exasperation, Senator Warner looked at me and says, "Chuck, I am never voting for a commission again." But, you know, we got through that. We thought we produced a reasonable bill. I'd also say, Michael said that Rumsfeld was sending snowflakes to the president. He was also calling the chairman of the Armed Services Committees and saying, this is what my position is, this is what I need. That would translate.
I'd gotten you on the record on that.
But so that was when you're working your responsibilities on the Hill. That's what the chairman wanted, and that's what you went out on the floor and fought for. And then we sent the bill over to the House. Something very different came back in December. Some things were sorted out, and we got what we got. Is it a good bill? I won't spend a lot of time on this, but one of the first things that I had to do when I went to the Hill in 1999 was Les Brownlee was the staff director at the time, and the first thing he had me do was to do some research on Goldwater Nichols, which was the huge reorganization of the defense structure in 1987. And the reason he had me do this was because Jim Locker, a former staffer on the Armed Services Committee, and then later the Assistant Secretary of Defense, the first ASD, SOLIC, Special Operations Low Intensity kind of thing, was writing a book on the, I guess at the time it must have been the 15-year history, 10 or 12, 15-year history of Goldwater Nichols. So I got out all of the old executive records of Goldwater Nichols. There were 3 huge leather-bound volumes that were in the National Archives, and went through them in detail. What you come out of Goldwater Nichols with was Jim Locker started working on Goldwater Nichols in 1982. Law was passed in 1986. In the 85, 86 time frame, when it was going through committee action, they had the opening session, and Barry Goldwater was the chairman of the committee at the time, and he gavelled the first markup session to order and said, "Staff has done a great job on this bill. I think we can knock this out in 1, maybe 2 executive sessions." Okay? This is after 4 years of staff work on the bill. 22 executive sessions later, 4.5 months, 86 amendments, 56 of which were Senator John Warner's amendments trying to protect the Navy. We ended up with Goldwater Nichols. So from my standpoint, that was due deliberation, on something that was a significant reorganization of the Department of Defense. I always lamented that perhaps we didn't get quite the same level of due deliberation on the Intel bill, but it had so much momentum at the time. It was so important in the national debate at the time. We got what we got, and now it's all about implementation.
Michael, that's a great setup for the question I actually had intended to ask you anyway. So just picture the summer into the fall of '04. You've got a presidential election. You've got 2 wars going on. You've got an incredibly flawed national intelligence estimate that was the underpinning for one of those 2 wars. You've got the worst attack on American soil in the nation's history, with 3,000 of our citizens dead. And hanging over all of this, Michael, is someone suggests the answer to this dilemma, the answer to these failures, is to reorganize are the 9/11 families who will not let this rest. So you saw the deliberations in the executive branch. You got to see an awful lot of the deliberations on Capitol Hill. John McLaughlin was the acting DCI when all this was going on. And I recall John describing the deliberations to me one day while this is happening. Keep in mind, John is running the CIA and is acting head of the American intelligence community. He said that he felt as if he were a patient on a gurney. He was surrounded by all these people in white lab coats, and they were all poking at him. And he continually looked around at the walls trying to see any evidence of a medical diploma. Michael, who knew what they were talking about as this bill was being formed? Who actually had it together? and understood what it was they were doing?
I think General Hayden is hitting on a key criticism of the process going forward, which I think helps explain the dilemma we're in today. The 9/11 Commission got a lot of advice about don't politicize intelligence. I'm not saying they were trying to do so, but people were urging upon them, you should put out your recommendations after the 2004 election. Let's not discuss such incredibly important national security matters in the heat of a presidential debate. What the 9/11 commissioners admitted to me in the book, and I put it in the book, is that not only did they intend to put it out in a presidential election, they desired and hurried the report so that it could come out in the heat of a presidential election because they wanted to cause a bidding war between John Kerry, the Democratic nominee, and put President Bush in the position of either having to endorse the 9/11 Commission report, which would have been a political win for the Commission, or thereby create a political issue in a heated presidential battle if President Bush did not seek to reform intelligence in the way that the 9/11 Commission statesmen had asked that it be done when President Bush's leadership was in question because of the Iraq War and indeed because of his performance prior to 9/11. Not only that, the CIA was, I think, particularly bitter that Senator Frist in the United States Senate gave the jurisdictional pen, the people who actually wrote the legislation for the U.S. Senate, not to the Senate Armed Services Committee, where Chuck served, that has tremendous expertise on defense matters, nor to the Intelligence Committee in the Senate that studies the intelligence community all day long, but to a third committee, the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee, which had recently obtained jurisdiction over the Department of Homeland Security, but otherwise had no expertise whatsoever in matters of national security or intelligence support to the warfighter. And so, from the view of the House of Representatives, from many in the CIA, and indeed many across the national security infrastructure in the United States, of course here in Washington, they thought that we had put in or given the ball to national security to in what they considered national security neophytes, who up until recently their chief jurisdictional subject was the U.S. Postal Service, which is something the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee has particular expertise on. You consider the presidential election, the fact that this committee had bill writing authority, and you put on top of that, as Chuck said, that the 9/11 Commission families, which Senator Slade Gorton of Washington State later described as the most powerful special interest group he had ever encountered in all of his years in Washington. And what you put together was an undeniable political force that took an idea that had been around for 50 years and it rocketed through the U.S. Congress at record speed and indeed was enacted, signed into law 4.5 months after the idea was proposed by the 9/11 Commission. One of the things I argue in the book, and then I'll throw it back to General Hayden, was due to the speed at which the Congress and the President considered these changes to the intelligence community, I think did not allow for a full discussion of what would have been the best solution for American intelligence after 9/11 and after Iraq. And indeed, the legislative process, which I detail in the book, was so confusing, so polarized, and indeed so politicized that there was never a meeting of the minds between the House and the Senate and the President about what we wanted out of a restructuring of the intelligence community. There was never any settled set of facts on what were the problems of 9/11, what were we trying to solve, and whether the solution posited by the 9/11 Commission was indeed the right way to go. As a result, because of the rushed circumstances of the bill's passage, I think this helps explain the controversy that the DNI underwent in its first at least 5 years of existence, and arguably is still undergoing today. You saw 3 DNIs in 4 years, and you saw Director Blair, who was President Obama's choice for a Director of National Intelligence, take on the Central Intelligence Agency on the question of who's in charge, a DNI or a CIA director. And Director Blair appealed to the White House on 2 particular disputes: who governs covert action and who appoints chiefs of station for the CIA. That's the chief intelligence officer in each foreign outpost around the globe. And in both cases, the DNI lost his appeal, lost his bureaucratic dispute when the White House ruled against him. These were, merits aside, these were losses that the DNI took in the first few years of its implementation, and arguably have created a situation where the DNI is struggling to meet the responsibilities that have been asked of the DNI with a set of authorities that perhaps were never strong enough in the first place, as the 9/11 Commission recommended, and certainly weaker once it got through the congressional process than even the 9/11 Commission had recommended in the first place. So this is the situation we find ourselves in today.
Chuck, I want to ask you to elaborate a little bit on the congressional struggle. You mentioned a phrase that's familiar to the 3 of us up here, but perhaps not to many in the room, Section 1018 of the law. And what was that about? Who pushed it? And how much did it finally affect what the bill did or did not do?
Well, the phrase we used for it was preservation of authority. The motivation for the language came from the White House. That it was and that was based on feedback they were getting from cabinet secretaries, but especially one particular cabinet secretary. But in essence, it's the kind of the famous provision on the Hill in any bill. If you put in there, notwithstanding any other provision of law, and it kind of trumps everything else. This was the same sort of language of nothing in this bill shall abrogate the authorities of the cabinet secretaries. So from when we first proposed that language, I mean, we got it sent up to us, and when we first proposed it over to Senator Collins, our immediate reaction on it was, this undoes everything in the bill. I can't accept this. And we went through a lot of back and forth, as you'll recall, getting David Addington, Vice President Cheney's counsel at the time, to propose some alternate language, and then that ended up making its way over to the House, as you outline in your book. But it's all fascinating, sort of back and forth, to try and preserve authorities. I think what I was thinking of, as I was reading the book, some people thought, well, we can deal with this idea of less authority than we had hoped for. That the director CIA reports to the DNI, but it doesn't say authority, direction, and control. And so you can drive a truck through that. Certainly didn't have authority, direction, and control over those elements of the intelligence community in other departments. But he had budget authority. So I think the prevailing sense at the time is, in Washington, money speaks. Over time, this will work itself out. He will be able to accumulate power over time, he or she, whoever occupies the office. And it will be an evolutionary thing. And a lot of people will contrast it to, if you go back to the National Security Act of 1947, that we created the Department of Defense, and the first Secretary of Defense commits suicide, and he has a department in disarray. And a lot of people would tell you that the Department of Defense, that now is the preeminent department in government, In 1950, 55, 1960 even, it was kind of a department that was meandering. And it was, my opinion, I think other people's too, but it was Robert McNamara with exercising his vision of budget control over the department that finally started to organize the department into a coherent organization with his PPBS system of budgeting. So you say, well, what's that, 47 to 62? You know, so maybe we need that much time for the DNI to consolidate its power. But the Secretary of Defense never lacked authority, direction, and control. That was always in the law. That's still not in the law for the DNI. So I think that remains a challenge in terms of him being having the kinds of authority that he would need to direct the community. And that's where we get back to the debate. Do we want someone that directs the community? That's where you get into the discussion of, is that operational? Is he directing intelligence operations? Or is he a more strategic player that is positioning, posturing the community through budget authority to conduct the operations that need to be conducted?
If I could, let me follow up on that point. Because in the last 48 hours, you have some senators, the one that comes to mind is Senator McCain, who wants to hold not just the director of NSA responsible for the leak of the Snowden information, but wants to hold the DNI responsible. And there's a lot of getting murmurings that somehow or another it's his responsibility, since he's an overall fill in the blank, direction, authority, control, coordination of the American intelligence community. That struck me. Just invite your thoughts on that, given what it is you've just said. How much does Jim Clapper, do stick and rudder for the operations, not the budget or the personnel accounts, but the operations of American intelligence?
Well, I think one of the things that we've always talked about with this DNI is what we ended up with somebody with a lot of responsibility, but not a lot of authority to carry out those responsibilities. In this case, he's not directing the operations of NSA on a daily basis. He has a pretty good idea of what they're doing. Any director that's not keeping him informed of what's going on, but not direction on that sort of stuff. For the specific sort of a situation we're in right now, I guess one of the things that I've reflected on is probably what we haven't done, and I use the euphemistic we, but because I still feel like I'm in the community sometimes, but what the intelligence community hasn't done a very good job of doing over the last several years is explaining, is being transparent and explaining to the American people how we go about doing intelligence in this modern era. I think you got involved in some of that when you were the principal director, and then, well, probably at NSA, then as the principal director. When McConnell came in, one of the issues he focused on was the FISA courts, and he would always talk about communications have changed. You know, the old way of doing intelligence, the old way of doing SIGINT was getting in between a communicator, and intercepting in between the 2 points. When the internet came around, the basic way that communications move around the world changed dramatically. And sometimes, even though it may be a foreign communication, some of those communications go through the United States. We had laws that said you couldn't intercept those communications going through the United States, and that was what an awful lot of that debate about, the FISA courts, how we authorize to be able to look at certain things and so forth came about. But we still haven't done. We won that battle, but we still haven't done, I think, institutionally, from an intelligence community standpoint, a good job of informing the American people about what the realities of intelligence collection are in this modern world. How good we are at doing it, how important it is to protecting the country. We've gotten extraordinarily good just because of 9/11, in terms of how we had to react to that stuff and how we had to make sure that nothing like that happened again. But now we got to figure out how to communicate that in the right way to the American people about how important this is, how much effort is taken to protect privacy and civil liberties, and how good the intelligence community is at protecting this nation.
Thank you. Michael, I read the book. It's wonderfully detailed. I thought I lived it and I learned stuff going through what you provided there. Step back from all your research, all right, and kind of overlay it with your judgment. What were they trying to do? Did this ever have a chance? And should we try again?
Look, at an intellectual level, the book is primarily about bureaucratic politics in Washington. It's about the Department of Defense and the intelligence community struggle over who manages $80 billion of the intelligence community budget, and then the exact same bureaucratic fights that play out in the United States Congress from the committees that have jurisdiction over these particular departments and jurisdiction over the intelligence community. So, in essence, this is a story about bureaucratic politics in Washington. But if you lay that aside for a second and you consider what the 9/11 Commission was trying to do, at an intellectual level, it makes some sense in that you need someone who is at the top of the pyramid who can make judgments about, do we need 10 years from now more human spies, CIA spies doing human collection? Do we need more signals intelligence? Are we keeping technologically ahead of our adversaries? At an intellectual level, it makes sense, especially when you consider that CIA directors like General Hayden have said, I don't know how CIA directors before me, when they wore two hats, CIA director and head of the entire intelligence community, were able to do both things at the same time. So at an intellectual level, I see what they were trying to do. I'm not sure they gave them enough authority bureaucratically to be able to succeed. I think, though, as Chuck said, the enterprise deserves more time, and I'd like to make one particular recommendation. The book goes through the arguments that we relied upon in convincing ourselves that a DNI would have more authority over the Central Intelligence, over the DCI in the old system pre-9/11. We told ourselves that with enhanced budget authority and enhanced ability to hire and fire, that all intelligence agencies would look to the DNI as its leader because those are fearful powers. I think what we've learned is that we focused on the wrong elements when we considered the authorities for a director of national intelligence. But to get to my recommendation, one way you may be able to make it work is if you have strong presidential leadership backing the DNI, where it's very, very clear that the president considers the DNI's mission, well, one, what does the president consider the DNI's mission to be? Is he operational, or is he more of a strategic thinker? And if he's more of a strategic thinker, what are the three things that the president is expecting out of a director of national intelligence? And then from there, to make it indisputable that the president backs that agenda, because that would bolster the power of the DNI if the other bureaucracies across town believed that the DNI was working on behalf of the president. Similar to the National Security Advisor's authority. The National Security Advisor in the White House doesn't have authority and direction control over anyone except for his staff in the old executive office building, but that is remedied because they believe that the National Security Advisor is acting at the behest of the President of the United States. If the DNI had a stronger wind in his sails,
he might be more successful than he is now. And so that's an element that we need to be able to consider when we move forward. And by the way, on the issue that you raised initially with Chuck, it's another thing that the intelligence community needs to be able to survive stressful times. We talked a lot about the intelligence failures of Iraq and 9/11 and the stress that that put on the CIA. The Snowden matter has put enormous stress on the National Security Agency and across the IC. And what the community needs and what the D&I needs to be is to take a note from General Hayden's playbook, who was not only served his country admirably and with the greatest of confidence, but one of General Hayden's strengths is that he was the explainer-in-chief. He understood that in the modern age of telecommunications and oversight, we needed someone to stand up and explain the mission of the intelligence community. The president should do that more often, and the D&I is someone who at least ought to be able to stand up on behalf of the entire intelligence community enterprise and explain what its mission is, why it's important, and why privacy and civil liberties are being respected. So I think that you can compensate for some of the bureaucratic inadequacies with strong presidential leadership, and you can have a successful intelligence community if in the modern age you speak forthrightly and clearly to defend its mission.
Thank you, Michael. Chuck, one final question for you. The way I looked at the legislation, all right, is that the American intelligence communities, like any complex organization, whether it's the IC with 100,000 folks and $50 billion or a complex university, any complex organization has to balance unity of effort for the whole and autonomy of action for the parts. And if you go too far in any direction, you're begging for failure. Michael, I think the analysis here, or at least the theory under which they were operating, was we didn't have enough unity of effort. And they wanted to pull things into the center. But your book, as good as it is an American story. It's about American bureaucratic politics. It's a focus on the American political process. It's on the American intelligence community. Chuck, there are a lot of countries with intelligence communities. Has anyone else out there done a better job at synchronizing and harmonizing the different parts of its intelligence community? Are there any models we should have gone to school on?
I don't think so. The one, we've mentioned Secretary Rumsfeld a couple of times here, but the guy that was his Undersecretary for Intelligence, Steve Cambone, was central in a lot of this also, but he had a term that he liked to use was exquisite intelligence. And that is something that we've developed in our intelligence community, especially over the last 12, 15 years. I mean, it was good, in the 90s, but it's the sort of things that our intelligence community is capable of doing now is just extraordinary. That comes with a lot of expense, that comes with lots of other things, but they're good at doing what they do, and I think most people will tell you, and to the point about this being a book about bureaucratic struggle in Washington, I think it's a great description of the legislative process, because, forget your civics of what happens on the Hill. I mean, that's what happens on the Hill. But this idea of that Michael put out there about the president and how he interacts with the Director of National Intelligence. I think the phrase I've used for it is it's got to be that the president embraces this position. And I don't know if you would disagree with me. The Bush administration did support ultimately the 9/11 commissions and supported the creation of a Director of National Intelligence, but I don't think that's quite the same as embracing the position and the concept. And you mentioned the two incidents where Director Blair took something to the White House and lost. Not only lost, but lost publicly, to the point that he was pretty injured, fatally injured, in terms of being able to continue to carry out the duties of the office. But that would seem to say, again, that that position had been embraced, and I think you've made the point a couple of times, what the optic that is shown, who appointed, if reports to Director CIA reports to the DNI, who appoints the Director CIA? And that's where we get into an interesting discussion, because one of the points I did want to make was to come back to the CIA. If you're somebody in the rest of the community, the rest of the intelligence community, I was an Army officer, an Army intel guy for 28 years. You were an Air Force intel officer for longer than that, before you kind of got to these higher level things. But if you're in the community but you're not part of the CIA, it's always like the CIA somehow is better than everybody else. It's like Animal Farm. Everybody's created equal, but some are more equal than others. But after when I worked at the DNI for 5 years and you interacted with the CIA on a regular basis, one of the things you come to learn is the CIA is an extraordinary organization. And it has such power to attract extraordinarily talented people to come work for it. And these are some of the most talented people that this country produces, coming out of the best schools and all of that sort of stuff. I mean, it really is an extraordinary organization. One of the things that I think was flawed in the bill, and it was a late ad, and if you go back to all of the things that were swirling around at the time, the 9/11 Commission, the families, the emotion of the time and so forth, the failure to predict WMD in Iraq that was really simmering at the time. There was a mood on the Hill to be punitive to the CIA. And one of the last things that was added into that bill was that the DNI shall not be co-located with any other element of the intelligence community. What that really said was the DNI can't be co-located with the CIA. That was probably a big mistake, in my mind, in retrospect, because what the DNI needed to be able to do was to draw on the entire community, but especially on the sort of talent that was resident in the Central Intelligence Agency.
Michael, one final question for you. I love you're getting Bob Gates' emails. I spent 6 years of my life reading other people's emails. That was when I was director of NSA. So you got them from the secretary. And he had very strong
Gave
views.
them to
Yeah, I
me
understand,
for
I understand. And he had very strong views about the power had to be sufficient for the new DNI. And he judged it was so insufficient, he wasn't going to take the job. Okay, so Jim Clapper is named the Director of National Intelligence after Denny Blair gets beaten down by the White House in 2, as you said, Chuck, very public squabbles with the Director of CIA. On the weekend, Jim gets announced. Saturday morning in the Rose Garden, Jim is there with Sue and some of the grandkids, and the President introduces the new DNI. Secretary Gates recommended Jim for the job because he was Secretary Gates' chief intel officer. Gates is not in town. Gates is in Central Asia. He's on an airplane coming back from Kazakhstan. And he walks back to the back end of the aircraft, and it's clear to me that he just wasn't going back there to get a drink of water or another glass of wine. He wanted to talk to the press pool because he spoke to the press pool in whole paragraphs, not in short, truncated responses. And he actually said, you shouldn't be thinking of the DNI as a chief executive officer. He's more like a powerful head of a committee on the Hill. There's a really different view of the job that he expressed in the emails to you in 2004. Was Secretary Gates just resigned to that reality and maybe taking a page out of a Jack Nicholson movie that this is just as good as it gets and we have to deal with it?
I think Secretary Gates, having been a former director of Central Intelligence when he sent those emails to the White House that he gave me, recognized that the position might not be vested with enough authority and recognized that its mission was confusing. I say towards the end of the book, sort of a summary to illustrate a point about there being no meeting of the minds on what the DNI's job is. If you'll just bear with me for a second. Gates compared the DNI to a congressional committee chairman. Former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee saw him as chairman of the board of directors. Hadley and Clapper see the DNI as a leader and a coordinator. Bush saw the DNI as akin to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Others see the DNI as an orchestra conductor. Hayden preferred coach to quarterback because quarterback was too operational. That was the authors of the bill preferred to call the DNI a quarterback so that he would be able to direct things as diverse as the hunt for Osama bin Laden all the way to satellites requirements. Ambassador Negroponte, the first DNI, likened the post to the manager of a baseball team because he's not out there playing on the team, but he's playing an important role. And David Ignatius likened it to a holding company where you leave the managers of the operating divisions, the head of the individual agencies, to do their jobs. So I think part of the story of the DNI is that so many people have different visions for what the DNI should be doing for the country. This was one of the most important things that we did as a country after 9/11 in Iraq to try and remedy some of the perceived failures, and it's something that I think we have to address as a country moving forward, not only for the sake of national security, but to ensure that we have better and more effective government, so that we have some sort of settling of what we think the DNI's role is, because we have too many challenges ahead in terms of not only the multipolar world we live in and the rise of different powers around the world, counterterrorism, counterproliferation, and leaking our playbooks to our enemies. We have got to be able to settle down and figure out what we expect out of these institutional reforms so they might be able to succeed.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And let's open the floor up for questions now. There are microphones on both sides of the room. Here we go. Sir.
General Hayden, you mentioned Senator McCain's fulminations. One of the things that he said was we're sharing too much information. At least that seemed to me what he was saying. Anyone on the panel have an opinion whether we went too far after 9/11 in letting everyone have access to everything within the intelligence community? Is there a way to stop somebody like Snowden to just access everything?
Chuck, you're being accused of sharing too much information. Want to handle that?
I think the answer I would give to that one is that, and one of the whole purposes of creating a director of national intelligence was to encourage that sharing of information, and a sharing of information at a relatively low level, you know, for official use only information with state, local, tribal, some classified information with state and local authorities, so that you can pull together the entire enterprise. Sharing information with close foreign partners. And I think kind of the sentiment at the time was, I won't say there can't be too much sharing, but you know, there are places where we know that we need to protect certain things, and we can do a pretty good job of doing that. And but there's an awful lot out there that needs to be shared, and it becomes even more useful information once you can add it to the context of information that somebody else has and pull out all that together. So I think the moniker is sharing, for the most part, is good. Can I give you a good explanation for what happened? I can't give you a good explanation for what happened. We've got the technological tools, we've got the capabilities to make sure that those sorts of things shouldn't happen. And I think you'll see that we will do a better job in the future of trying to implement those sorts of safeguards to make sure the really important stuff stays where it's supposed to stay.
I think Michael wanted to add something.
I can just add quickly that I think this is a test for the governance structure that we've set up. Will the DNI or the White House be able to force the intelligence community to rapidly adopt the type of technologies that allow us to share information, but at the same time restrict who sees it? So we need to be, the private sector has this type of software. You can tag the information as it comes into a database and later have on the other end of your desktop a set of accesses that you're allowed to see. And you can actually petition for, if you believe you have a need to know a particular item, you can be aware that something exists in the neighborhood of something you need to know and petition to a higher up to be able to see that information. But is the intelligence community postured today to be able to rapidly adopt this type of technology? I think it's an open question, and it's a test for not only the DNI but the governance structure of the IC.
Yeah, but your question and Chuck and Michael's response suggests a theme we've hit pretty heavily here, and that's about bureaucratic politics. The bureaucratic incentives for sharing were so reinforced after 9/11 that all of us who did this knew this Manning or Snowden was inevitable. It was just lined up that way because of the way of governance. Now, Michael's point, I think, is also well taken. This may be a real opportunity for the DNI to step up and do something that, frankly, even though he may be shy a brick or two in his rucksack, he's best positioned to do this. When Secretary Powell did his speech at the UN prior to the invasion of Iraq, and he played 3 intercepts on the floor of the General Assembly, George Tenet had to get my permission as the director of NSA to reveal signals intelligence information. That's how it was then. I don't think it's yet clear that the DNI has absolute authority to declassify that. But this is an opportunity for the DNI to strengthen such authorities, that he is actually setting the rules for what's in and what's out when information gets shared. So I'm kind of with Michael. It's an opportunity.
Hello? Hi? All right. Seems to be on at least somewhat. Thank you for coming here tonight. We've got FISA and various constitutional and other statutory protections for Americans and other sources that you may want to target either within the U.S. or elsewhere. And I'm curious how the various agencies within the intelligence community have responded since 9/11 in being asked to be responsible a lot more for Homeland Security missions, and yet, not being as flexible to operate, in light of all those protections. Thank you.
Well, you hit on something I should have mentioned, which is when I mentioned that there was an intellectual case for a DNI. Part of it was for the reasons you mentioned, which is that by history and tradition, people are generally uncomfortable with the idea of CIA officers looking at personally identifiable information about U.S. persons. They actually don't want to look at information about U.S. persons either. What the 9/11 Commission decided was that we needed to create a new structure that would be able to fuse information collected within the United States with intelligence collected abroad. That was what a lot of the critics of the 9/11 Commission's recommendation of a DNI said, which is that the real problem on 9/11 was the lack of fusion of information across the foreign domestic divide, and the solution to that would be to co-locate analysts from across the intelligence community in the same place. We have that now. It's the National Counterterrorism Center. Most people think that its analytical function, the one I just described, analytical fusion, has been a success. I think generally, more specifically to your question, is, are we doing a better job of collecting information that would be pertinent to a threat that exists within the United States? And I think this is something that is an open question today, and that is whether the FBI has adapted to this post-9/11 mission. We said in the post-9/11 period that what we wanted out of the FBI was not just for them to be law enforcement. We wanted them also to be intelligence officers. The FBI or the CIA felt picked on by the 9/11 Commission report. They felt that at least half of the so-called faults for 9/11 should reside in the inability of the FBI to be able to communicate forthrightly about what it saw in terms of particular hijackers acting within the United States. And the 9/11 Commission, essentially gave the FBI a pass and said, we trust Director Mueller to be able to reform the FBI into an intelligence gathering information organization in addition to its law enforcement mission. So that's a long way of saying I think that analytical fusion has improved. Have we gotten enough collection out of the FBI? I think that is an open question and something that deserves further study from Congress and the DNI, actually.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think if Robert Mueller, the director, left a month or so ago after 12 years, and he became the FBI director like
The week before 9/11.
the week before 9/11. I think if you ask him, what was he most proud of, I think one of the things that he would say was that he did transform FBI into much more of an intelligence agency, whereas before it was a law enforcement agency and a little bit of counter-espionage, counterintelligence. But I think he would take a lot of pride in having changed that culture and putting them on a path. That said, I think they're still on the path, and there's more to do. I think the general conclusion, because what are we now? We're 12 years after 9/11. Are we better at putting that stuff together in the homeland? Yes. Is it complicated? Yes. That's where you get into the things like the 12 or 18,000 law enforcement agencies, the 600 tribal entities that control a lot of our borders, the private sector that often has critical information that needs to be brought into the equation. Have we got a perfect system for pulling all that together yet? No. But I do feel like the one thing that's pushing us further in that direction faster than might have been is the whole world of cyber and how ubiquitous it's come and how vulnerable we feel. And so that really is starting to push that sort of information sharing between entities, state, local, tribal, private, and federal.
General Hayden, you said that you tried to put a few bricks into the rucksack of the DNI. How did you do that, and how effective do you think it was?
The recommendation, Jim, during the debate was you needed to put statutory authority into the rucksack of the DNI because the DCI actually had considerable authority that was a byproduct of the fact that he was the director of the CIA. George would call me routinely, far more than anybody in the Department of Defense would call me when I was at NSA. And George would always say, hey, Mike, my guys were just in here, and I want you to go do that. And the antecedent of my guys was never his little 150-person DCI community management staff. My guys referred to his CIA staff. And now, as Chuck pointed out, the one thing the law actually made very clear was this guy was not going to head up CIA. He couldn't even pitch his tent on the Langley campus. And so the great fear was, since you're pulling that which has given us our current glue out of the center of the community, now the DNI, boy, you better put a lot more stuff in there statutorily, because you will not enjoy any of the informal authority that a DCIA would have acting as the center of the intelligence community. I'm with Michael. I think the current theory can work, if everyone knows he's the president's guy. Number two, the personality of the DNI matters. All right, there are some personality types, brilliant as they might be, I don't think works. And number three, the relationship between the DNI and the DCIA has to be quite close and intimate. And the formula I had with Mike McConnell was, I thought Mike owed me running room, and Mike thought I owed him total transparency and what was going on. If you get those three right, I think Michael's theory is you can make this structure work even with the lack of statutory authority.
This is a little bit in the weeds, but I think the 9/11 Commission recognized that what they were doing was maybe creating less authority for the center. Because what they recommended, and this is sort of a historical footnote now, is that they recommended that the DNI be in the executive office of the president, inside the White House. That was rejected by everyone involved almost immediately. But in trying to defend the idea, the 9/11 Commission admitted that they were trying to compensate for the fact that they were taking the community management functions out of Langley, where at least the CIA director, or at least the DCI, was able to rely on the troops, the analysts and the collectors at the CIA. They tried to compensate with it by putting it at the White House. That did not work politically for anyone involved. And so the result is that you had roughly the same amount of authority in terms of budget and hire and fire, but you had less of a bureaucratic pedestal on which to exercise these authorities. So this is where the argument comes from, that what we did was actually create a system where the center was less strong than it was under the previous system that General Hayden is talking about when he was interfacing with Director Tenet.
I'll very quickly add a footnote. This whole debate about should the DNI be in the White House, everyone rejected it for fear of politicization of intelligence. All right, you just couldn't have the senior intelligence advisor of the president on the president's personal staff. The optics bad, and frankly, I think the reality's bad. But when we had a defanged DNI, and that would, I think we'd all agree, that was Denny Blair, and it wasn't Denny's fault, all right? He was never in the inner circle. We actually had Plan B with a man acting as senior intelligence advisor on the president's personal staff, and that was John Brennan. And so for about a 2-year period, we kind of put our toe in the water with the 9/11 Commission approach. It wasn't formal, it wasn't de jure, but there was a fair amount of de facto going on, and might explain one of the challenges Admiral Blair had in terms of breaking into the inner circle, because that immediate intelligence advisory need was being filled by a very talented, very experienced career CIA officer who was just a few feet from the president's office. Question?
With some of the changes and revelations, some people are talking about adding some type of opposition in the FISA court, so it's not just one side presenting the evidence. I was wondering, with the increase, I think you guys make a great case for increasing the responsibility of the DNI in controlling the different intelligence agencies, but if do you think there needs to be some more people added that have the responsibility of kind of making the opposition case, so that they have not only, say, the CIA director, but the ideas at least of the, what are the downsides of this as well?
Yeah, let me invite Michael to come in this, perhaps in his persona as staff director of the House Intelligence Committee, where these things get discussed.
Here's what I think one solution might be, and that is to add maybe an amicus office inside of the FISA court. But I wouldn't put in hardcore statute that there is someone whose job it is to oppose the government's every motion, because I think what that does is sort of further this myth that the FISA court doesn't aggressively look at what the NSA and the Justice Department put before them. People who like to call the FISA court a rubber stamp put out this argument that, oh, well, 99.9% of their applications are automatically granted. what that statistic I believe is misleading, at least is from how we saw things at the Intelligence Committee, and we've got the former head of NSA here, so maybe he should speak to this also. But what we saw was a very iterative process between the judges on the FISA court and the clerks and the others that worked there, that were able to say informally before issuing a ruling, hey, this isn't going to work, you need to be putting these safeguards in to ensure that U.S. persons are protected and the rest. And so while I think it might be something we need to do to increase confidence in the mission of the intelligence community, to put some additional layer in there somehow, I wouldn't make it so rigid, because I think the premise of the question that we don't have aggressive oversight is false.
I'll just add very quickly, and there may be merit, as Michael suggests, in this amicus office, not for individual warrants, but for those macro decisions that they've made about 702 and 215, the FISA Act and the Patriot Act, all right? But let me just point out something I think it's clear to us, and I don't think it's clear to the general population. What's odd about the FISA court is not that it's secret, and it's not that only the government is represented. What's odd about the FISA court is we go to a court for intelligence activity. No other Western democracy has the judiciary involved in these questions. They are reserved to the political branches, the ministers and the parliament. So what's unusual about our system is that we already involved the third branch of government, which no other democracy has done. But that doesn't counter the point, maybe, certainly for the level of confidence that people have in it, something like that might be useful. Time for one more, sir.
I want to follow up on the notion of explainer-in-chief and ask if there's an opportunity to be a little more transparent, not because a Manning or a Snowden forces it, but because it's in the self-interest of the community to allow a little bit more transparency, to engender trust in what they're doing. And perhaps the example you cited, sir, of the 3 clips. You know, when it's prudent and doesn't compromise sources and methods, to go ahead and let the people see what's happening so that it counterbalances the very public failures. Or worded differently, that little saying about truth setting you free that's at the entrance, maybe if we sprinkled a little of that truth around, it would be in our self-interest.
Well, I agree. I want to turn it over to you. I agree, because I think in this age of, if there's going to be a new leak every day, that the intelligence community needs to fight fire with fire and be able to put out some of the success stories to be able to counter the narrative that has been put out there and unfortunately perpetuated by Snowden.
Folks here from my class have heard this already, but I'll share it. When I was director of CIA, I worried about the broader cultural trends within which we were operating. All right? Need more clarity on that. I asked Carly Fiorina, who was a member of my advisory board, to head up a subcommittee. Go to the mountain, think about this for a couple of months, and come back and tell me. Will America be able to conduct espionage in the future inside of a broader political culture that every day demands more transparency and more public accountability from every aspect of national life? And they went away, came back several months later, and gave me a definitive, well, we're not sure. And that's probably right. All right. I am sure that we will not be able to conduct any espionage without a level of confidence from the American public that perhaps we're a bit shy of right now. And that then will require us to be more transparent and more open with information than we have historically been. Now, historically, we've actually been pretty open compared to other governments, all right? But we live in our political culture, not in other countries' political cultures. And so I think we've got to be more transparent. By the way, that will shave points off of operational effectiveness. Okay? That will make it more difficult to do the job. But my overall theory, I think, is consistent with what you were suggesting. But you got to do that and accept the loss, because if you don't get to do it. You don't get to do it in the first place. You just won't have the public consensus. So I think, and that actually may be. I mean, we may have stumbled into an opportunity here that the DNI can do this in a way that the individual discipline directors, CIA, NSA, NGA, would just find it more difficult to do, because he can then tell a more holistic narrative than any of these individual groups. I want to thank Chuck and Michael for coming here and sharing their thoughts. I also want to thank you for coming and being here today. Apropos of the last question, people of our background certainly aren't used to being in the newspaper every day. We hardly ever view that as a good thing. But we now know it's a thing. And it's going to be a continuing thing. And therefore, we're going to have to trust the future of our discipline to the judgment of the American people. And I have a lot more confidence in that process if it is an informed judgment. Again, our being more transparent, but the American public actually being interested. The way you have shown interest coming here tonight to discuss this actually very interesting and very critical half a year in American history that's had a very powerful hand in shaping the intelligence community we have today. So I think the three of us want to thank you for coming here and sharing your thoughts and showing your interest. And with that, let me turn this back over to Jamil.
Great. Thank you, General Hayden. Thank you, Michael, Chuck, for coming. Thank you, the audience. Just want a couple of notes. In the upcoming edition of the National Security Law Journal, we'll have a review of Michael Allen's book by Genevieve Lester. In addition, the book is available outside if you'd like to purchase copies, and Michael would be happy to sign copies if you'd like. And there's plenty of food and drink, so please drink and eat up. And thank you all for coming. It's an important time in the intelligence community, and more to come as we see what happens on the Hill, both with FISA and additional oversight of the community. Thank you all for coming.